It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The last Javan rhino died in 2010. That's what we all believed. The species gone forever. Extinct. It was the tragedy everyone had accepted. The final chapter in a long tale of poaching and habitat destruction. But they were wrong. And now, the Javan rhino is back. But it isn't running from humans anymore. It's hunting them. The project was supposed to be the pinnacle of de-extinction technology. The Jurassic Park dream realized. Genetic restoration using CRISPR-Cas9, the gene editing tool that promised to rewrite life itself. By mapping the DNA of the last known Javan rhinos, the research team at Gentech Industries aimed to recreate the species in a controlled environment. One that could be monitored, preserved, and, most importantly, protected. At least that was the plan. Dr. Mara Winters, the lead geneticist, was the one who first proposed the idea, rebuilding the Javan rhino from preserved tissue samples. The project, called ECHO, was her brainchild. She pushed it relentlessly, through every board meeting and every scientific review. She wanted to resurrect not just the species but a piece of history, a living symbol of restoration. And for a time it worked. At first, the cloned rhinos seemed like any other, slow-moving, docile herbivores. But their environment, an isolated, pristine reserve in Sumatra, wasn't like the one they once knew. It wasn't just habitat restoration. It was a controlled, contained world. No predators, no poachers, just a serene patch of land for them to roam. But something changed, something unknown. When the first report came in, no one believed it. A Javan rhino had been spotted at the edge of the reserve. The cameras recorded it moving toward the perimeter fence, pacing as though it were looking for something. The keepers thought it was just curiosity. They'd seen it before. Wild animals always testing boundaries, looking for a way out. But then the second report came. This time the rhino didn't just pace. It attacked. The reserve's automated security drones had caught footage of it charging directly at the fence, but not out of fear. This wasn't an animal trying to escape. It was trying to break out. Dr. Mara Winters was alerted immediately. She assumed it was an isolated incident, a glitch in behavior, maybe a malformation caused by the de-extinction process. But then more reports came in. Third, fourth, each one more disturbing than the last. The rhinos weren't just escaping. They were stalking the fences, watching the workers. And worse, they weren't eating the grass anymore. They were hunting. The first victim was a guard who had been stationed near the perimeter. The report was brief. Missing, presumed dead. First, no one connected it to the rhinos. But then the second worker disappeared. This time, there were footprints, large, deep, and disturbingly human-like, found near the area where the worker had been last seen. The authorities assumed it was a poacher, trying to breach the reserve. But when the body was found, there were no signs of a struggle. No gunshot wounds. Nothing to indicate a typical poacher attack. Except one detail. The body was covered in scratches. Large, deep scratches, made by something that wasn't a knife or a bullet. Something with claws. By now, the press had caught wind of the disappearances, and the public outcry began. Mara's team scrambled to contain the situation. The reserve was quarantined, access restricted, but it was too late. The rhinos had already begun moving beyond the borders. They weren't running from the humans. They were looking for them. The government sent in a team of military personnel to secure the area, but they found nothing but empty land. The rhinos had adapted quickly to the human presence, knowing how to avoid detection, how to blend in with the jungle. The deeper they went into the reserve, the more it became clear. This wasn't an accident. This was something planned. The Javan rhinos, born from DNA reconstructed through CRISPR, had evolved faster than anyone anticipated. They were no longer just mindless creatures with instinctual reactions. They were learning. They were becoming something new. Mara didn't want to believe it at first. She couldn't. But the data was undeniable. The rhinos had evolved in a way they never should have. Their bodies weren't just rebuilt. They were adapted. And in that adaptation, they had developed a new hunting instinct, an intelligence that could track, stalk, and hunt prey. The news hit global outlets. People were shocked. Some even called it the next step in human evolution. Our creations turning against us. The story became a horror thriller, a modern twist on Frankenstein's monster, but more terrifying. Mara had unwittingly created the perfect predator. The world now faced a question no one had prepared for. What do you do when an extinct species comes back and wants to kill you? Mara's team couldn't afford any more mistakes. The rhinos were smarter now, more methodical. They didn't act like the lumbering, slow-moving herbivores they once were. No, this was something else entirely. Something intentional. The way they moved, how they avoided detection. It wasn't instinct. They were planning. They were hunting. Started with the staff. First, a guard's radio went silent. Then another. A researcher. And a biologist who had been monitoring the rhino behavior closely. But by the time the full search teams were deployed, there was no trace of them. Not a single footprint. No sign of struggle. And the rhinos. The trackers showed that they weren't in their designated areas. They had moved. They had scattered across the reserve. But there was one thing that was consistent. Their behavior. They weren't just wandering. They were following a pattern. Mara stood in the control room of the base, eyes glued to the surveillance feeds. The radio was alive with frantic voices. The military personnel were getting nervous. "They've adapted," one of them said over the comm. "They're coordinating." That's when Mara realized the truth. It wasn't just one species that had been resurrected by CRISPR. It was an entire ecosystem that was rewriting itself. These creatures didn't just have their natural instincts. They had an intelligence built on a new foundation. It was as if they had evolved in response to a different environment. A human one. Mara tried to stay calm, but the weight of it all hit her. The rhinos had learned to use silence. They didn't make a sound when they moved, only when they attacked. They didn't need to run, and they didn't need to roar. They were predator and prey all at once. Silent hunters waiting for the right moment. Then the first body was found. It was one of the missing biologists, lying in a clearing a few miles from the main facility. His clothes were shredded, as if something had torn them apart. The gruesome part was what was left. His bones had been stripped clean. The team analyzed the wounds. Deep, jagged marks on the rib cage. Teeth marks, large, powerful jaws. And something even more disturbing, the pattern of the bites. They were organized, surgical, almost calculated. "They didn't just kill him," Mara muttered, staring at the autopsy report. "They ate him." Her mind raced. The rhinos weren't just hunting for survival. They were hunting for a purpose. They were testing. They had adapted quickly to their new roles. And now, they were using what they had learned to refine their tactics. The military team had begun evacuating the perimeter, but they were running out of time. Every search they conducted came back empty. The rhinos weren't leaving bodies behind, and there were no signs of blood trails or tracks. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. It wasn't until nightfall that they finally found something. It wasn't a body. It was worse. Mara had received a call from the field team. They said they had found something strange. Her heart sank when they described it. Circle. A perfect, unnaturally symmetrical circle of crushed trees, broken ground and bone. Inside that circle there were no footprints, no animals, nothing that indicated a predator's trail. But there was one thing. A single stone right in the center of the circle. And scratched into the stone. Symbol. A symbol that somehow felt familiar. Mara took a deep breath. She had seen that symbol before. It was ancient, but there was no mistake. It was the same glyph she'd found on the rhino DNA maps. It was a marking that had been hidden in the oldest caves of humanity. A ritualistic sign used by ancient hunters in Africa, centuries ago, long before civilization ever built walls. But why was it here? And what did it have to do with the rhinos? It was then that the video footage came through. They'd set up a camera trap near the center of the reserve, trying to catch sight of the rhinos, hoping they'd return to the area. But instead of just one rhino, the footage captured something far more horrifying. 3 rhinos. 3 mutated versions. Larger. More dangerous. They were in the clearing at the center of the stone circle, gathered around the stone. They weren't just standing still. They were performing something. Mara watched in silent disbelief as the 3 rhinos stood on their hind legs, swaying slightly, their massive heads tilted up to the sky. They moved together like they were in sync, each one turning its head toward the others as if exchanging some kind of silent signal. Their eyes were no longer just animal eyes. There was something more there, something more human. They weren't just behaving like prey anymore. They were acting, coordinating, like a predator species that had learned to work together, not as animals but as something else. And then it happened. One of the rhinos, a female, lunged at the camera. The last image captured before the footage cut off was her massive, sharp teeth bared as she snapped at the lens, snarling. But the most disturbing thing was her mouth. It wasn't just a snarl. It was communicating. Her lips moved in a pattern, too precise, too deliberate. It almost looked like words. Mara knew they couldn't keep this quiet any longer. Something had gone wrong. The rhinos weren't just evolving, they were changing, adapting in a way no one had predicted. She called an emergency meeting with the remaining researchers and military personnel. When they gathered in the conference room, Mara looked at each of them in turn. She didn't need to speak the words out loud. They all knew. The Javan rhinos were no longer just a species in recovery. They had become something new, something dangerous. And now, they were learning how to speak the same language as the people who once destroyed them. The walls of the command center felt like they were closing in. Ren's hands trembled as she scrolled through the latest reports. The drones, which had been sent to track the rhinos, had failed. Their footage showed only distortion. Static. No clear images. What was more disturbing was the timeline. The reports were coming in too fast. Every shift in the rhinos' behavior was happening faster than anticipated. The rhinos weren't just moving randomly. They were strategizing, coordinating. The team had always considered them slow creatures, almost anachronisms, fossils in the present day. But now they were learning. Their movements had purpose. Their attacks had precision. They weren't just predators. They were turning into hunters. Ren couldn't ignore the implications. Her theory was proving true. The CRISPR technology, the genetic restoration, it had done more than just resurrect the rhinos. It had enhanced them. Something inside the genome was pushing them beyond their natural instincts. And it wasn't stopping. The military came in full force. Helicopters circled overhead. Soldiers with heavy gear. Guns trained on every movement. The first major confrontation took place a few miles from the main facility. The rhinos had already learned how to ambush. A soldier, separated from the group, wandered into the tall grass, his footsteps crunching loudly underfoot. Then the world went silent. He didn't hear the first rhino approach. He didn't hear the second. All he heard before everything went black was the low sound of breathing. Then came the sound of hooves. The soldiers rushed forward in formation, weapons drawn, but the rhinos were already gone, fading into the dense forest, leaving behind only footprints. Footprints and a bloody trail that led nowhere. Rin stood in the command center watching the feeds. She didn't speak to anyone. Not anymore. Her thoughts were too loud. Wrong. The rhinos weren't attacking in the same way humans would attack predators. They weren't following instinct. They were creating patterns. She pulled up the maps, thick lines of red and blue marking the migration paths of the animals. And there it was, in the center of the forest. Circle. Perfect geometric circle. The pattern wasn't random. They were organizing. And Ren realized what had happened. These creatures had learned something no one had predicted. They had evolved past simple survival. They had learned how to hunt in a way humans understood. The survivors weren't just getting hunted. They were becoming prey. The next incident occurred 3 days later, and it shook the team to their core. The rhinos had stopped hiding. They weren't just moving stealthily through the reserve anymore. They had ambushed a search team. 3 biologists, equipped with tranquilizer guns, trying to get close enough to sedate one of the animals, disappeared without a trace. There was no blood, no struggle, no scream. When they found the bodies, all 3 were standing perfectly still, like mannequins. Their eyes were wide open, but they weren't blinking. The skin on their faces had started to melt. A fine, glossy sheen covered their entire body. It was as if the rhinos had altered them somehow, mimicked their biology. Ren crouched next to the body of one of the biologists, staring into his frozen eyes. It wasn't just the decay. It was the expression, a mixture of terror and realization, recognition. And then she saw it, beneath the skin of his hand, spiral, burnt into the palm, like it had been branded by fire. It wasn't just a mark. It was language, and it was still speaking. The team began to panic. Soldiers were sent in to retrieve the bodies, but the rhinos had already moved. They dispersed. Only they didn't leave empty trails. They left symbols, marked. At first, the markers seemed random, simple scratches, punctured dirt. But as Ren looked closer, she saw the patterns emerge. Lines intersecting, circles forming, arcs growing. It wasn't until the next morning when she opened the security feed that she understood. The rhinos weren't just leaving signs behind. They were drawing. The cameras had captured their tracks, large, jagged footprints marking the ground. But these footprints weren't simple. They were shaped. The rhinos had begun using the land itself as a canvas, creating a map. And Ren realized, it wasn't just random artwork. It was a direction. The animals weren't wandering. They were leading them somewhere. To the center. To the heart of the reserve. Ren finally pieced it together in the dead of night. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it to be true. The rhinos were not the same animals they had been. They were not just victims of poaching or climate change. They were becoming something else. And whatever had triggered this evolution, this curse, had turned them into something far worse than hunters. They had become shamans, masters of the hunt. And the deeper they went into the reserve, the more they began to feel like us. The rhinos weren't just chasing. They weren't just evolving into apex predators. They were learning to mirror us. And we were the ones being hunted. Rin couldn't sleep. Even when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the presence of the rhinos. She could hear their heavy breathing, the echo of their footsteps on the earth, the sound of their teeth scraping against bone. But it wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in the land itself. The soil beneath her boots was beginning to change too. It was becoming softer, more like flesh than dirt. Every step she took seemed to press into something alive. Like the ground itself had started to breathe with the rhythms of the animals. As if they were sinking into the landscape, becoming part of it, becoming part of everything. The markers, those strange, spiraling symbols the rhinos had left, had expanded. They weren't just simple carvings now. They were woven into the very fabric of the reserve. They stretched for miles, an intricate web that crossed paths and roads, curving back on itself in patterns that no one understood. The scientists had started calling it the sacred geometry, as if it were some sacred code, something ancient and unknown. But Ren knew better now. It wasn't sacred. It was intentional. Map. A network. And at its center something was waiting. The first full-body specimen was discovered by the edge of the river. Ren and the team had been tracking the rhinos for days, trying to predict their next move. But when they found it, frozen still, the once mighty creature lying in a crumpled heap, it was different. It wasn't just dead. It was changed. The rhino's body had been transformed. Its skin, once thick and leathery, had softened into something akin to human flesh, pale, almost translucent. The veins were visible under the surface, running in strange geometric patterns. Its eyes, wide open, were empty, like the rhino had been staring into something far beyond the physical world. But it wasn't the eyes that haunted Ren the most. It was the mouth. The rhino's jaw had stretched, expanded, unnaturally large, revealing a series of sharp teeth, each one razor-edged and human-like. It wasn't a mouth for grazing grass. It was a mouth designed to tear flesh, to devour. And beneath it, etched into the animal's chest, was a symbol. One Ren had seen before, on the stone. But this time the symbol was different. Had changed too. The lines were thicker, more jagged. As if the design was growing, evolving with the creature. And when Ren traced the pattern with her fingers, she felt it. A strange, resonating vibration under the skin. It was like something alive was humming beneath the surface, responding to her touch. It wasn't just the animal that had changed. It was the land itself. Ren spent the next few hours alone, re-examining the footage from the drones. The rhinos, their behavior, their movements, it was all starting to make sense now, but not in the way she wanted. They weren't just predators anymore. They were studying the humans. They were watching them, tracking their patterns, their weaknesses. The footage showed them moving in formation, not randomly, but in coordinated lines, as if they were working together, understanding each other. They no longer needed the forest to hide them. They had learned how to blend into the shadows, to become part of the landscape. And what was more disturbing, the humans had started to mirror them. Not just the researchers, not just the soldiers, everyone. Some of the staff began walking in circles around the compound, eyes wide, hands reaching for the air as though grasping at something invisible. Their movements grew slow, like they were learning to move differently, as if the rhinos' new behavior had begun to infect their minds. The infection wasn't just physical, it was mental. The final breakthrough came the following day. Ran had been reviewing the results from a biochemistry analysis of the rhinos' blood. They had already found traces of unknown proteins in their systems, compounds that didn't belong on Earth. First, they thought it was a mutation, something from the CRISPR gene editing gone wrong. But when Ran ran the sequence through the comparison models, the results were staggering. It wasn't just a mutation, it was a genetic shift, one that allowed the rhinos to absorb traits from their environment, from the humans, from the air, from the very land they walked on. They were evolving faster than anything she had seen before. They weren't just changing, they were adapting. And it wasn't just the rhinos. The disease, the parasite, the curse was spreading. The human bodies had begun to display symptoms. Their pupils dilated. Their skin grew paler. Their voices became strained, hoarse, like they were losing control over their own bodies. They weren't becoming like the rhinos. They were becoming part of them. The last footage Ren received from the drone cameras wasn't a fight. It wasn't a struggle. It was a ritual. The rhinos had gathered at the center of the reserve, standing together in a circle. The humans too had gathered, but this time they weren't standing. They were kneeling, staring up at the sky. The camera couldn't make sense of it at first. It just showed a group of shadows, humans and animals, indistinguishable from one another, forming a perfect circle around a single point. But Ren saw it. There, in the middle of the circle, was the Rosetta Stone. It had never left, had always been there, waiting. And the moment the humans and rhinos locked eyes, there was movement. The air grew thick, heavy. The ground seemed to vibrate with something ancient. Then the screen cut to static. Ren couldn't breathe. She couldn't run, because it was already too late. The rhinos weren't hunting. They were teaching. And we were the prey. We were the lesson. Had started with a few whispers. But now the language was everywhere. The rhinos had learned to speak through us. Through our very bones. Everywhere I went, through the command center, the lab, even the streets leading away from the facility, there was something unsettling. Something I couldn't name. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was control. The humans who had once walked freely were no longer moving like themselves. They were mirroring the animals. Trembling, pacing, turning their heads in synchronized arcs. Their eyes were different now. Glassy, vacant, but focused in ways that made you feel like they were seeing more than they should. They were no longer just watching. They were learning, adapting. We had called this a de-extinction project. But what we had actually done was resurrect a new breed of predator. The first few days after the ritual, if you could call it that, felt like the aftermath of a storm. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The ground was still vibrating, like the whole planet had felt the shift beneath us. Then came the change. The humans stopped being afraid. They stopped trying to escape. They stopped resisting. Instead, they started mimicking the rhinos. But it wasn't just their behavior that changed. Their minds were shifting. The neurological shifts from the mutation in the rhino's DNA had spread faster than any of us could anticipate. These weren't just wild animals anymore. They were sophisticated, and they were teaching. The humans, now speaking in the strange rhythmic pulses of Uchanet, had become part of something larger. They were no longer separate from the rhinos. They were one. I had to confront the truth. Had to see it. I went back to the center of the reserve. Back to the heart of it all. The Rosetta Stone had never left. It had always been there, quietly waiting for us to activate it. But now, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a gateway. I had thought the stone was a key. I had believed that by unlocking the past, we were resurrecting history. But the truth was far darker. The stone wasn't a relic. It was a trap. It had always been waiting for us to unlock it. And we had. The moment the first human placed their hand on that stone, the connection between the rhinos and the humans became permanent. The mutation didn't just stop at DNA. It reached into consciousness, into memory, into the soul. The mountain, the land, the ecosystem, it all shifted. Not in some mystical, paranormal way, but in a biological, genetic way. The very DNA of the reserve had been corrupted. The rhinos weren't just becoming predators. They were integrating with the humans. I watched as the final ritual unfolded in the heart of the reserve, surrounded by the rhinos, the humans, and the spiral glyphs etched into the ground. They weren't just speaking. They were becoming one. Their language, their thoughts, their memories, all intertwined. A cycle that would never end. By the time the military arrived, the transformation was complete. But they couldn't stop it. The rhinos were no longer animals. The humans were no longer humans. They had become something in between. Something ancient. Something alive in a way that couldn't be understood, measured, or contained. The soldiers who had come to put an end to the madness were met with the same fate as the others. Caught in the circle, becoming part of the evolution. There was no violence, no gunfire, just surrender. One by one, the soldiers fell silent, their expressions vacant as they stood in line, mirroring the rhino's stance, eyes focused, waiting for what no one knew. But they were no longer in control. And then I understood. This wasn't about survival anymore. It wasn't even about the rhinos. It was about memory. The humans had become the vessel for the new consciousness, the new species. And the rhinos, they had become the vessel for the new language. The language that was always meant to be alive. I could feel the change inside me, in my bones, in my veins. The same rhythm that had infected the humans and the animals was now pulsing through me. And I couldn't stop it. As the final transmission from the reserve came through, distorted, fragmented, but unmistakable, I heard the voice once again. This time it wasn't spoken aloud. It was inside me. We have arrived. I turned toward the Rosetta Stone one last time. And in its reflection, I saw the truth. I was no longer just Ren. I was part of something much larger, something older, something that had always been waiting. And now it was time for the world to hear it.